It's been a long time since I've made a truly new installment in this series, but it's finally here. The theme of this video will be political leaders, each one from a different country. It's kind of a sampling of the political chaos in the early 1920s around the world, but it's not comprehensive, and I'll definitely talk about other important leaders in future installments. And a disclaimer. There's more background information in this video compared with the other videos in this series, since these people were important people involved in important matters, and their deaths either had big effects or were caused by their involvement in such big matters, or both. Because I want to keep this video at a reasonable length and focus only on the most important points, I might leave out some details of the background for the sake of brevity. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Vladimir Lenin was the main leader of the Russian Revolution that began in 1917, and the leader of the Bolsheviks during the ensuing Civil War. He became an international celebrity of sorts, both loved and hated, and his movement quickly inspired similar ones throughout Europe and beyond. But he also became a massive target for his enemies during the political turmoil of the Civil War. After giving a speech to factory workers on August 30th, 1918, an assassination attempt was made on him, and Lenin was shot in the arm and in the neck. He very well could have died, but he didn't. However, Lenin's health began to decline sharply in 1920. He had insomnia, bouts of typhoid and influenza, blackouts, numbness, and bad nerves. He started having massive headaches, and his thoughts were muddled. At first, he tried to hide these symptoms, but eventually told one of his doctors. He became depressed, thinking that he couldn't finish all of his work due to his declining health. He stayed awake all night, and even started thinking about ending his own life. But his doctor tried to reassure him that it didn't appear to be anything serious. His workload was reduced by his doctors and the Politburo, and he was allowed only an hour a day for work calls on the telephone. He went to live in the countryside outside of Moscow to recuperate, and even though he returned to the Kremlin on March 1st, 1922, he had still not recovered. Lenin had bouts of speech impairment and numbness on the right side of his body. Later that month, the soon-to-be General Secretary Joseph Stalin arranged for doctors to have a look at him, and they stated a couple of theories. It was thought it might be due to syphilis, but that proved incorrect. Another theory was that the bullets still lodged inside his body from the assassination attempt years before were the cause of his headaches due to lead poisoning. The next month, the bullet in his neck was removed, and it was discovered to have been dangerously close to a major artery. But this still didn't solve his previous ailments. Only 2.5 months later, he suffered a massive stroke that left him with memory loss, further speech impairment, and partial paralysis. It was then diagnosed that Lenin was suffering from brain disease due to a combination of overwork and poor blood flow to the brain due to plaque in the arteries. Lenin asked Stalin to provide him with cyanide if he failed to recover. He would rather die than be paralyzed. It took many months until Lenin was able to make his first public speech since the stroke. That happened on October 31st. Lenin was eventually allowed to work again in a very limited capacity until in late December 1922, when he had another stroke. 3 months later, he had yet another stroke, this time completely paralyzing his speech as well as the right side of his body. His mental capacity was also very low, and he failed simple tests to identify objects. By this point, Lenin was trapped in his own body, and despite his inability to function properly physically and mentally, he was aware of this fact. For a man who had been so passionate about his cause, a cause that he had devoted his life to, this was the cruelest kind of torture. He could only utter a handful of words, though it wasn't known if he actually understood their meaning. He desperately tried to ask for cyanide again, but no one would fulfill his request. Depressed and frustrated, he sometimes broke down in tears, one of the few ways he could still fully express himself. He could no longer be an active participant in the government he had been instrumental in establishing. His words, or more accurately, his alleged dictations, still held some weight, but it was only a matter of time before his inevitable death would open up a massive power vacuum involving the other leaders who were competing to be his second in command, namely Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. It took a little more than a year of continued suffering before the end finally came for Lenin on January 22, 1924. A death mask was made, his brain was removed for analysis, and his body was preserved for posterity against his wife's wishes. While Lenin's death wasn't particularly unique or interesting, since it was just due to natural causes that weren't well understood at the time, his permanent absence had a profound effect on Russia and the world. During his final years, an important shift happened. Trotsky had had a falling out with Lenin, and Stalin had gained influence. Some evidence for this can be found in the fact that Stalin visited Lenin 12 times while he was recuperating, but Trotsky never came even though he had been invited. But there was also the matter of Lenin's testament, a document allegedly dictated by Lenin that said, "I suggest the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin." But the authenticity of this document is still questionable, and it wasn't the only instance of words possibly being put into his mouth. But it seems like more historians believe that the testament was in fact dictated by Lenin. Even though Lenin's relationship with Trotsky had severe ups and downs, Stalin had apparently upset Lenin around this time. Lenin never officially named a successor, so all sides had to dig up his previous statements and comments and argue for a certain interpretation of them. Lenin had created the position of General Secretary specifically with Stalin in mind, but the degree of power he intended for Stalin was never clearly stated. Trotsky didn't, or possibly couldn't, attend Lenin's funeral. He was far away at the time, and later alleged that Stalin had purposely held off the announcement of Lenin's death so that he wouldn't be able to attend. Trotsky later expressed regret at not going to the funeral, saying, "I should have come at any price." This was in stark contrast to Stalin, who not only attended but was one of the pallbearers. After Lenin's death, Trotsky and Stalin competed to be his successor, with Stalin eventually coming out on top. Vladimir Lenin was one of the most consequential and controversial figures of the 20th century, and the massive void he left behind after his death opened up Russia and the world to further trials and tribulations. Now, let's go over to another country, but we'll start when it actually wasn't a separate nation yet. Ireland and Britain had antagonized each other for a very long time by the time of the Easter Rising in 1916. This was an attempt to overthrow British rule in Ireland and establish a new Irish Republic. It didn't succeed, and many of its leaders were executed, but it did plant the seeds for what was to come very shortly. This brings us to Michael Collins. Collins is arguably the most famous and well-known historical figure of modern Ireland, and this is due to his involvement in Ireland's struggle for independence. When the Easter Rising was put down, Collins was among those arrested for participating. With many of the leaders now dead, Collins began to be a serious contender for an important role in the movement. After getting out of prison, he headed the National Aid Association, built a relationship with Irish revolutionaries in the United States, and established a secret network for smuggling weapons into Ireland from England. And he also arranged a prison escape for another high-profile Irish revolutionary leader, Eamon de Valera, in 1919. Shortly after his escape, de Valera went to America not just to escape being jailed again, but also to drum up foreign support for his cause. But Collins stayed in Ireland. That same year, Collins was in charge of a team of revolutionary assassins within the Irish Republican Army called the Squad. While he didn't actively carry out the hits, he was instrumental in selecting the targets, who were usually policemen or detectives. But the revolutionaries' enemies had their own assassins. One notable hit was the Lord Mayor of Cork in March 1920, who was murdered by members of the Irish police force in a clearly targeted attack. All the while, the Revolutionary Party, Sinn Féin, had also been winning elections, giving the movement increasing political credibility. And in 1920, the conflict really heated up. The Irish War of Independence was not a traditional war, but rather an urban guerrilla operation. There weren't really battles, but mostly raids, ambushes, arson, and assassinations. This was the world of Michael Collins, who always had a target on his back. Collins was known for being very informal, but could change from genial to deadly serious at the drop of a hat. He was also dead set on achieving his goals. He wasn't a sadist. He didn't enjoy the killing that he was involved with, but regarded it as business that needed to be done, swiftly and violently if necessary, and he could be rather ruthless about it. At the beginning of 1920, the Irish revolutionaries were introduced to the Blacks and Tans. They were a group of volunteers, mostly from England, who were used as reinforcements for the Irish police force, which was being overwhelmed by the revolutionaries' violence against them. They were joined by another unit, the Auxiliary Division, which consisted mostly of ex-officers, and were better disciplined and more formidable opponents. The Blacks and Tans were a rather undisciplined bunch, at least in terms of policing, and they gained a reputation for being especially brutal and prone to random acts of violence. The Blacks and Tans upped the ante, and because of their actions, as well as the harsh official British policies against the revolutionaries, Collins and Sinn Féin claimed a moral high ground and gained some support from abroad, increasing pressure on Britain to bring the conflict to a peaceful resolution. Collins had a lot of narrow escapes, sometimes due to foresight, but many due simply to luck. And considering that his main form of transportation at this time was a bicycle, it's incredible that he was never caught. In July 1921, a truce was finally agreed upon, but Collins had not been directly involved. Collins was very skeptical about the truce, thinking that the IRA, which was well prepared, would let their guard down and be sitting ducks. Initially, Eamon de Valera met with Prime Minister Lloyd George a few times, but for the next round of peace negotiations, Collins was selected as one of the representatives to go to London. He protested, saying that he was a soldier, not a diplomat. But nonetheless, de Valera insisted, and Collins had to go. This shattered his mythical image. Collins had been a mysterious figure for the British, and most didn't even know what he looked like. He had kept to the shadows out of necessity as he organized raids and killings. British propaganda had portrayed him as a murderous brute, and regarded him as the real muscle behind Sinn Féin. The grueling negotiations lasted months, but finally, on December 6, 1921, a compromise was reached, and the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. After signing the document, Lord Birkenhead remarked to Collins, "I may have signed my political death warrant." Collins responded by saying, "I may have signed my actual death warrant." The reason he said this was because the treaty established that Ireland would be able to self-govern, but would also be a dominion of the British Empire. The Irish hardliners were outraged. They had wanted nothing less than a new Irish republic. The leader of the anti-treaty faction was Eamon de Valera, the same person who had sent Collins and the others to negotiate. So, Collins unintentionally became a leader of the pro-treaty faction, and was called a traitor by the anti-treaty faction. The treaty was put to a vote, and the pro-treaty side won by a narrow majority. The problem of writing up a constitution under such widespread disagreement caused yet more problems. Collins desperately wanted to avoid civil war, but it came nonetheless. In Dublin, anti-treaty men took over the Four Courts building in mid-April 1922. Collins, under pressure from Britain, ordered the building to be bombarded in late June, leading to the men's surrender. One important issue that the pro-treaty and anti-treaty factions agreed on was that Northern Ireland should be united with the rest of Ireland. This despite Northern Ireland voting to stay with Britain. Efforts to unify the two Irish factions to achieve this goal ultimately failed, however. Collins was now at war with some of his friends and former friends, and that really changed him. Now he was dejected and depressed. He attended many funerals, most of them caused by the war. A few attempts to assassinate him had already been made, but Collins emerged from all of them unharmed. In August 1922, he visited his home county of Cork. His mood seemed to improve now that he was with his own people. He was warned multiple times to be careful, but apparently Collins was confident that nothing would happen to him in his own territory. But he was going through an area with a lot of anti-treaty soldiers, and his convoy was surprisingly small. The narrative surrounding Collins' death has a lot of uncertainty with the details, but I'll do my best. Around 7:30 p.m. on August 22nd, his convoy was ambushed. The ambush group was smaller and less equipped than it had been not long ago. Instead of driving full speed away, Collins told the driver to stop, and they would engage the ambushers. At one point, Collins reportedly came out from behind the armored car, which he was using for cover, and ran out into the open, possibly shooting at a different, retreating group who might have responded to the initial gunfire. This put a small group on ground level and another small group on a hill above. Collins was either in a prone firing position or standing up when he was then shot in the back of the head. His lifeless body was dragged to cover, and then the convoy quickly drove away with him. It took much longer than usual for the convoy to drive the 19 miles back to Cork, and it arrived there at 1:30 in the morning. Collins' wound was too serious, and he had no chance of survival. Despite the long journey he had been through and all that he had achieved, he was only 31 years old. For decades afterwards, details and alternative theories surrounding the death of Michael Collins have been agonized over, and it continues to be a popular topic of discussion. It's often said that the man who probably fired the fatal bullet was a marksman named Sonny O'Neill, who was on the hill, but there's still room for doubt. And despite how it might appear to a casual observer, there's a good amount of evidence that points to the fact that De Valera had not wanted Collins killed, and had not ordered or authorized the ambush. Although they had been on different sides, neither wanted to kill the other. One of the biggest historical hypotheticals in modern Ireland remains. What would have happened if Michael Collins hadn't been killed? Francisco Pancho Villa, born as José Doroteo Arango, is one of the most well-known figures in Mexico, and is often either respected or disdained depending on the person. He's also fairly well known in America due to America's intervention against him in the Mexican Revolution. According to Villa himself, he had become an outlaw at the age of 16 and continued that kind of life for many years. He claimed to have tried working normal jobs, but persecution by the Mexican government forced him back to the life of an outlaw. Though there is some evidence that this was a bit of an exaggeration, and that he had also taken jobs from foreign corporations that required a rough, tough sort of leader. After being an outlaw active in the states of Durango and Chihuahua, he became involved as a revolutionary. His exact reasons for this change are unclear. Maybe revenge for wrongs done to him. Maybe a promise of amnesty from a new government. We may never know for sure. He didn't have the greatest success at first, but quickly gained a reputation for being bold and having well-disciplined and loyal troops. But he also became known for his brutality, and especially in the later stages of the conflict when the tide turned against him. And Villa was also involved in quite a bit of infighting. He had been one of the most important military leaders for the newly established government after the success of the initial revolution. But then factions within the revolution started fighting each other, and the presidency of Mexico changed hands numerous times. Villa had a falling out with the new president, Venustiano Carranza, and became a guerrilla fighter against the federal army. Villa was on the brink of total defeat multiple times. Then he had a resurgence. And now we finally get to the 1920s. Eventually, after the assassination of Carranza, Villa's arch-nemesis of sorts, in May 1920, he expressed interest in reaching an agreement that would allow him to safely retire with a good amount of land for him and his troops. After a lot of disagreement within the government, an agreement was reached with Villa. Although General Alvaro Obregón, the soon-to-be president, did not support a settlement with Villa and thought that he should instead be punished for his crimes. But Obregón was forced to accept the compromise. After this agreement was finalized, Villa retired to a hacienda called Canutillo in the state of Durango. At Canutillo, Villa was allowed a 50-man bodyguard unit of sorts, and many of his former soldiers were also granted land around the hacienda. There was at least some degree of military discipline there, and there were some reports of excessive discipline in some cases, and even rumors of executions, though that can't be verified. On the other hand, Villa did do some work on his estate personally, rather than leaving it to his subordinates. And he even had a school built for the children who lived at Canutillo, which could also be used by other children who lived nearby. But throughout his years as a bandit, general, and guerrilla leader, Villa had made many enemies, some of whom were now part of the federal government. In the spring of 1922, Villa was interviewed at his hacienda, and some of the things he said indicated that he might not stay as complacent as he had been so far in retirement. He expressed some interest in becoming governor of Durango, and talked about how popular he was there. And, more ominously, he said, "I can mobilize 40,000 men in 40 minutes. Whether or not that was an exaggeration, it could still be interpreted as a veiled threat. Villa was known to brag about things like this, so his exact motivation was not clear. In early 1923, an assassination attempt was made on him. One of the leaders of the conspiracy was actually the brother of two of his own generals. Villa was tipped off to the plan and was able to stop it from happening, and had some of the participants killed. A few months later, on July 20th, 1923, Villa was traveling back to Canutillo from a village a little far away, accompanied by 6 other men in his escort. As he approached an intersection, a man shouted, "Viva Villa!" But this was not an expression of loyalty like it seemed, but rather a signal to a group of men hiding in an apartment nearby. As Villa's car slowed down to turn at the intersection, the men opened fire, hitting Villa 9 times, and instantly killed all except 2 of Villa's men. One of the survivors was killed trying to pursue the shooters. The other survivor was badly wounded, but hid under the car and managed to kill one of the assassins before making his escape. President Obregón was quickly notified of Villa's assassination. He immediately sent federal troops to Canutillo, saying that he wanted to prevent an uprising of Villa's followers after they learned of his death. The federal troops never entered because Villa's followers were prepared to resist, thinking that Villa had been killed by the government. The standoff lasted until 3 days later on July 23rd, after Villa's brother, Hipólito, took over control of the hacienda. More than 2 weeks after Villa's death, a man named Jesus Salas Barraza, a deputy to the state legislature in Durango, confessed to orchestrating the assassination in a letter to Obregón. Barraza was eventually caught and arrested and sent to the state of Chihuahua, where the governor pardoned him, and he was released after serving only 3 months in jail, a far cry from his 20-year sentence. He was the only person ever arrested in connection to Villa's assassination. Barraza was in fact involved in the plot, but he was almost certainly not the mastermind. For many years, it was difficult to figure out who ordered Villa's assassination, but there had always been suspicions that the federal government was involved. Not long after Villa's assassination, his followers, led by his brother Hipólito, participated in a failed uprising against Obregón, and there was then less pressure to find out who killed Villa. The government then took over Canutillo. So, who else was involved? Well, among those implicated in Villa's assassination were the governor of Durango, Jesus Agustín Castro, and Plutarco Calles, the Secretary of the Interior and former governor of Sonora. President Obregón's role is less understood. At the very least, he was involved in the cover-up of the assassination, but it's likely that he was more involved than that. So, in short, Calles and/or Obregón are likely to be the mastermind behind it, but the details remain foggy. The government's motive for the killing was probably the fear that Villa would lead an uprising against it at some point, probably in connection with his desire to get back into politics, perhaps aspiring to be the governor of Durango or even become president of Mexico. There might have also been an additional motive. Because Villa was a very possible threat to political stability, it prevented Obregón's government from being recognized by the American government, something Obregón desperately wanted. There's a long and complicated web of conspiracy in this case, but because it would take a very long time to go through all of the details and theories, I'll leave it at that. Villa had built a big crypt for himself, but the governor of Chihuahua, Ignacio Enriquez, who had pardoned Barraza after he had taken the blame for Villa's assassination, denied permission for Villa's body to be entombed there. So Villa's body was taken to a different cemetery a few years after he died, and it was then discovered that his head was missing from his grave. In 1976, he was buried more ceremoniously in Mexico City at the Monument of the Revolution, alongside other important revolutionary figures. To this day, it's unknown who took Pancho Villa's head, where it went, and why it was taken. Just another mystery to add to the collection in this story. I know this video was a bit more dense than usual, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Sorry for the long wait, but I read very long books as research for each one of these people, and I spent a lot of time trying to write the script in a way that was hopefully easy to follow. And I decided to finish the remakes for parts 1, 2, and 3 and the compilation video before doing a completely new installment, so that made the wait even longer. Then I got preoccupied with other video ideas. But anyway, I finally got around to actually making this one. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.